They saw Kim's small hands and assumed weakness, mocking her as she approached the disassembled engine, until the 850-pound block lifted smooth as prayer. Her knuckles went white, veins surfaced like cables, and the smirks died in their throats. The base commander, watching from his office, would personally request her transfer by morning. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Private Kim stepped through the entrance of Fort Ramirez Motor Pool Division at precisely 0645 hours on a cold October morning, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air that carried the sharp tang of diesel fuel and motor oil mixed with the metallic scent of old machinery. The motor pool stretched before her like a cathedral of military industry. Rows of olive-green vehicles standing at attention beneath fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered against the pre-dawn darkness, their glow reflecting off puddles of water and leaked fluids on the concrete floor. She was small, this was undeniable. Standing at 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 110 pounds, her Korean-American features delicate and her hands appearing almost childlike as she gripped the handle of her well-worn toolkit, the leather case showing years of use with scratches and oil stains that spoke of countless hours spent elbow-deep in engines. The toolkit had belonged to her father, a master mechanic and Korean War veteran who had spent 3 decades running an auto shop in rural Oregon before his death 2 years prior, and carrying it now felt like carrying a piece of him into this new world, where she intended to honor his memory by proving herself in the domain he had loved. Sergeant Walsh emerged from his office at the far end of the bay, a man of 45 years with the weathered face of someone who had spent more time under vehicles than behind desks, his gruff demeanor immediately apparent in the way he surveyed the new arrivals with eyes that missed nothing. He gestured toward the group of recruits already assembled near a row of Humvees, and Kim moved to join them, her boots making soft sounds on the concrete as she approached. The other recruits turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of their gazes like physical pressure, saw the moment of surprise register on their faces, the quick exchanges of glances that spoke volumes about their immediate assessment of her capabilities. Private Sullivan stood at the center of the group, 6 feet, 1 inch of former college football player, with the natural confidence of someone accustomed to being the biggest person in any room, his muscular frame filling out his fatigues in a way that suggested he spent considerable time in the gym. Next to him stood Private Brooks, equally muscular but louder in his presence, the kind of man who announced himself before speaking, and Private Carter, who seemed quieter but positioned himself in Sullivan's orbit like a satellite following a larger planet. Private Mitchell was already grinning, the joker of the group evident in his constantly moving eyes that sought opportunities for entertainment at others' expense. The only other woman in the group was Private Morrison, athletic and tall at 5 feet 8 inches, who regarded Kim with an expression that seemed carefully neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile but watchful. Sullivan spoke first, his voice carrying across the motor pool with deliberate volume. "They're letting anybody in now, huh?" It was not quite a question, more of a statement meant for the others to hear, and Kim felt the words land like stones, but kept her expression neutral as she set down her toolkit and began unpacking her tools with methodical precision. Sergeant Walsh called the group to attention and began outlining the day's training objectives, starting with basic diagnostic work on the light vehicles, and Kim listened carefully while her hands continued their practiced movements, arranging wrenches and sockets in the order she preferred. The morning progressed with assigned tasks, and Kim found herself at a Humvee running diagnostic tests on the electrical system, her fingers moving with practiced confidence as she connected the diagnostic computer and began running through the test sequences. She identified the fault quickly, a corroded ground connection causing intermittent starting issues, and moved to the next vehicle while the male recruits were still puzzling over their first assignments. She heard Brooks speaking to Sullivan in a voice pitched to carry. "Wait till we get to real work. She'll be gone in a week." Kim said nothing, but her jaw tightened fractionally as she moved to inspect a fuel injection system, her small hands proving advantageous as she reached into spaces that would have required disassembly for someone with larger hands. The diagnostic work was indeed easy for her. Years spent in her father's shop having given her an intuitive understanding of how vehicles thought and spoke through their symptoms. But she knew this was merely the opening act, and that the real tests would come when the work turned physical. Her father had understood this too, which was why he had trained her not just in mechanics, but in Olympic weightlifting starting when she was 8 years old, initially as therapy for a childhood illness that had left her small and weak, but eventually because he recognized in her the same stubborn determination that had carried him through combat and 30 years of hard physical labor. He had died of a heart attack in his shop 2 years ago, and she had enlisted 6 months later with his words echoing in her mind. Never make yourself small to make others comfortable. The first direct confrontation came at the end of the day when Private Mitchell accidentally left a heavy toolbox balanced on the edge of a workbench directly in Kim's path, the kind of accident that was clearly deliberate in its positioning. She saw it beginning to fall as she passed, the 70-pound steel box tipping toward her head, and her hand shot out with reflexive speed to catch it one-handed, her grip closing around the handle as her arm absorbed the weight without her stride breaking. Mitchell's eyes widened fractionally before he covered his surprise with a dismissive laugh and a comment about lucky catches, but Kim had made her mental note. They were testing her. Week 2 brought more complex work as the training progressed to engine rebuilding exercises, and with it came an escalating pattern of behavior from Sullivan and Brooks. They began offering to carry Kim's equipment with a performative chivalry that dripped condescension, their helpful smiles not reaching their eyes as they intercepted her before she could handle the heavier components herself. The transmission replacement task became a perfect example when Sullivan physically stepped between Kim and the hydraulic jack she was reaching for. His voice loud and theatrical. "This is too heavy for you. Let the men handle it." Kim was forced to stand aside and watch as Sullivan and Brooks wrestled the 300-pound transmission into position, and she saw them make 3 distinct errors in the process: the mounting bolts cross-threaded and the torque sequence wrong, and the fluid lines connected in an order that would cause airlocks. She called out the corrections quietly, and Sergeant Walsh, who had been watching from 20 feet away, nodded slightly but said nothing. He had been observing Kim since day 1, had noticed the precision of her movements and the speed of her diagnostics, and the way she calculated weight distribution and leverage points before moving any component. And something about her reminded him painfully of his daughter Sarah, who had been killed by an IED in Afghanistan while serving as a combat engineer. Sarah would have been about Kim's age now, and Walsh saw in Kim the same fierce determination his daughter had possessed, but military protocol and his belief in letting recruits work through their interpersonal dynamics kept him from intervening. He wrestled with the question of when observation became complicity, but he also knew that some lessons could only be learned through experience rather than instruction. Kim had her own strategy for dealing with the escalating mockery, and it involved the base gym at 0400 hours each morning when the facility was empty and dark, except for the corner where she set up her barbell. She trained alone in those pre-dawn hours, moving through her lifting routine with mechanical precision, chalk dust coating her hands as she pulled deadlifts, starting at 315 pounds for warm-ups and working up to her current training weight of 405 pounds for sets of 5 repetitions. Her father's voice guided her through each lift, his lessons about patience and timing and the physics of leverage. And she knew she was preparing for a confrontation that was inevitable. Private Morrison discovered this secret one morning when she arrived early for her own workout and found Kim in the middle of a set. The barbell loaded with plates that added up to more than most of the male recruits could lift, and Morrison stopped in the doorway with her mouth open. The 2 women regarded each other for a long moment before Morrison approached with questions in her eyes. But Kim simply continued her training, and Morrison kept the secret, though she grew more distant afterward, her self-preservation instinct making her reluctant to openly ally with someone the group had marked as an outsider. The lunch incident in the cafeteria during week 3 crystallized the dynamics into something more openly hostile. When Sullivan made a show of offering to carry Kim's tray, his voice projecting across the crowded space for maximum audience, Brooks added his contribution about her hands being smaller than his 8-year-old sister's. And Mitchell delivered the punchline that drew laughter from surrounding tables. Kim felt the heat of humiliation rise in her chest, but kept her voice level when she responded that these hands had rebuilt a 1967 Mustang engine when she was 13 years old. Sullivan's reply came with a condescending smile. "Sure they did, sweetheart." The nickname stuck, spreading through the barracks like infection, deliberately infantilizing and meant to reinforce her outsider status. At the end of week 3, Sergeant Walsh assembled the recruits and announced the final practical exam that would determine who advanced to the next phase of training. Each recruit would be required to diagnose a planted fault in an assigned vehicle and then demonstrate proper engine removal procedure, working individually to show both knowledge and capability. The engine in question would be a V8 diesel from a 5-ton military truck, weighing 850 pounds without any mounting hardware. And while standard protocol called for team lifts using an engine hoist, this was an individual assessment requiring individual problem solving. Sullivan turned to Kim with a grin that showed too many teeth. "Maybe they'll give you a lawnmower engine instead." The night before the exam, Kim was in the gym at 0400 hours, running through her final preparation, the barbell loaded to 455 pounds for her last heavy single before tapering for the test. She set her stance, chalked her hands, and pulled the weight smoothly from the floor to lock out. Her small frame coiled with tension as the bar rose without hesitation. Morrison entered the gym and stopped, watching the display with wide eyes. And when Kim racked the weight, Morrison moved closer with questions tumbling out. How was this possible? Where had she learned this? What was happening tomorrow? Kim's answers were simple. Physics, leverage, technique, and 4,000 hours of practice. Morrison understood immediately what Kim was planning, and her face showed a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They're going to lose their minds tomorrow. Kim nodded, her expression calm despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. Morrison asked if she could watch, and Kim's nod of permission sealed an unspoken alliance between them. 2 women against a system that had already decided what they were capable of before giving them a chance to prove otherwise. The morning of the exam arrived with an overcast sky that threatened rain. Cold wind cutting through the open bay doors of the motor pool at precisely 0700 hours, and each recruit stood at their assigned vehicle, with the tension of soldiers preparing for combat rather than mechanics preparing for a test. Private Kim drew what appeared to be the oldest and dirtiest truck in the entire fleet. A battered 5-ton transport that looked like it had survived multiple deployments, and she caught the knowing grins exchanged between Sullivan and Brooks, their amusement at her assignment barely concealed. The engine was partially disassembled but still mounted in the frame. Tools laid out on a nearby cart, and the engine hoist positioned conveniently within reach, its yellow paint chipped and worn from years of use. Sergeant Walsh gathered the recruits and explained the protocol in his characteristic gruff manner. Each recruit would diagnose the planted fault and then demonstrate proper engine removal procedure within a 4-hour time limit. And safety was paramount, with any unsafe practice resulting in automatic failure. The unspoken reality hung in the air like the diesel fumes. Physical capability was being tested as much as mechanical knowledge, and everyone in that motor pool understood this was about more than simply removing an engine. Sullivan went first, his approach textbook perfect, as he utilized the engine hoist with practiced efficiency, disconnecting systems in proper sequence and maneuvering the crane with confidence. Born of size and strength, completing his exam in 2.5 hours to nods of approval from Walsh. Brooks followed with a similar approach, though he made minor mistakes in his bolt removal sequence that cost him time, finishing in 3 hours, and Carter struggled slightly with his initial diagnosis, but eventually managed the engine removal with the hoist in 3.5 hours. Mitchell approached his exam with overconfidence that proved his undoing when he made a critical safety error by failing to properly secure the engine before disconnecting the final mounting point, and Walsh stopped the procedure immediately with a sharp rebuke that echoed across the motor pool. Kim was assigned the afternoon slot, last to go, And during the lunch break, she sat apart from the celebratory male recruits who were already acting as though they had conquered some great challenge, eating her meal methodically and hydrating with deliberate sips of water while mentally rehearsing the choreography she had practiced hundreds of times in her father's shop. Sullivan approached her table with that same condescending smile. "Need me to stick around? Show you how to work the hoist?" Kim's response was brief and level. "I'll manage." Brooks added his contribution from across the cafeteria. "Those little arms gonna operate that machinery?" Kim said nothing, continuing to eat with mechanical precision, her mind already moving through the steps she would need to execute, visualizing each movement and calculating the angles and leverage points she would require. A larger crowd than normal began gathering as the afternoon progressed, word having spread somehow through the base that the tiny girl was up for her exam, and spectators positioned themselves around the motor pool with varying expressions of curiosity, skepticism, and, in a few cases, genuine interest in seeing how she would handle the challenge. Morrison positioned herself where she had a clear view, her face showing both excitement and apprehension, and in the upper office window stood a figure that made Sergeant Walsh take notice. Base Commander Colonel Harrison, observing from his command post, a decorated veteran of 30 years' service who rarely attended routine recruit examinations. At precisely 1,300 hours, Kim stepped to her assigned station, and for the first 45 minutes, she worked in methodical silence, running diagnostic procedures, her small hands moving with practiced confidence through electrical tests and pressure measurements. And she identified the planted fault with impressive speed, a cracked cylinder head causing coolant to leak into cylinder 3, earning a nod of approval from Walsh, who noted she had diagnosed the problem faster than any of the others. Now came the moment that mattered, the engine removal that would determine not just whether she passed this exam, but whether she would finally show these men who had mocked and dismissed and patronized her for 3 weeks exactly what she was capable of achieving. Kim surveyed the engine, the hoist positioned conveniently nearby. The watching crowd growing larger and more attentive, and she felt the weight of their expectations and assumptions pressing down on her like physical force. She could use the hoist, pass conventionally, remain invisible and unremarkable, continue to let them underestimate her. But her father's voice echoed in her mind with the words he had repeated throughout her childhood. "Never make yourself small to make others comfortable." She thought of Walsh's daughter, whose name was engraved on the memorial wall she passed every single day. Sarah Walsh, who had died serving as a combat engineer in Afghanistan, and Kim made her decision in that moment with absolute clarity and certainty. She would show them who she was. Kim began disconnecting the peripheral systems with precise, efficient movements, fuel lines and electrical connections, and cooling system components and exhaust manifold. Each action deliberate and unhurried, and she removed the 8 heavy-duty mounting bolts that secured the engine to the frame, setting each one aside in careful order. She positioned herself, feet shoulder-width apart, body centered directly under the engine's center of gravity. And then she reached for the chalk bag attached to her belt, coating her hands with white powder in a ritual that immediately drew attention from the watching crowd. Sullivan's voice carried across the motor pool. "What's she doing?" Brooks responded with disbelief creeping into his tone. "Is she seriously planning to lift that thing manually?" Kim slid partially under the engine on a rolling mechanics pad, examining the lift points with the attention of someone performing surgery, and she attached 2 reinforced nylon straps to the designated lift points, looping them through and checking the configuration twice to ensure the load would distribute evenly. The crowd grew silent as understanding rippled through the assembled spectators, realizing what this small woman was attempting, and Sergeant Walsh stepped forward with concern evident in his weathered face. "Private Kim, standard protocol requires the use of mechanical assistance for engines of this weight class." Kim straightened to face him, her voice calm and steady. "Sir, the objective is safe engine removal. I'm demonstrating an emergency field extraction technique. No hoist required." Walsh paused, his eyes meeting hers for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, perhaps recognition that this moment was about far more than passing an exam. Proceed. But any sign of danger, I'm stopping this immediately." Kim positioned herself with the precision of an Olympic weightlifter approaching a competition platform, feet planted firmly on the concrete, back straight with natural spinal alignment, grip secured on the straps, with her hands positioned exactly where thousands of hours of practice had taught her they needed to be. Her breathing changed, becoming deep and rhythmic and controlled, the kind of breathing pattern that oxygenated muscles and focused the mind and prepared the body for maximum effort. The first pull sent tension through the straps as the engine shifted fractionally, metal groaning against the frame mounting points, and Kim encountered the initial 200 pounds of resistance required to break the engine free from where it had settled. Her legs drove with controlled power, quadriceps and hamstrings and glutes firing in coordinated sequence, and her core braced to protect her spine while transferring force from her lower body through her torso and into her arms. The second pull cleared the engine from its mounting points, and suddenly all 850 pounds was suspended by nothing more than nylon straps and human will. Kim's small frame coiled with tension as physics and leverage, and 4,000 hours of dedicated training allowed her to accomplish what every person watching had assumed was impossible. Every sound in the motor pool ceased as though someone had thrown a switch. The constant background noise of machinery and ventilation and distant vehicles, all fading into absolute silence, and the only sounds were the hydraulic hiss of Kim's controlled breathing and the creak of metal and nylon under tremendous strain, and somewhere in the distance a dropped wrench clattering on concrete. Sullivan's face showed shock transforming into something else. Some fundamental assumption about the world cracking and reforming. And Brooks stood with his mouth literally open, unable to process what his eyes were showing him. Morrison watched with a fierce grin splitting her face, and her fist clenched in solidarity, seeing in this moment the vindication of everything she had hoped might be possible. This was not a one-repetition maximum explosive lift, where Kim could simply pull the weight and drop it. She had to maintain control throughout the movement, walk the engine backward, 3 precisely measured steps to position it over the prepared receiving dolly. Her knuckles white from the crushing grip force required, and veins surfacing on her forearms like cables under tension. Her muscles trembled but held steady, face flushed with effort but expression focused and almost serene. The look of someone performing a task they had rehearsed so many times that it had become almost meditative. She lowered the engine onto the dolly with absolute control, guiding it down with microscopic adjustments until metal met metal with a definitive thunk that seemed to echo across the entire motor pool. Kim straightened slowly, breathing hard but controlled, and she methodically removed the chalk from her hands as though she had just completed routine maintenance rather than something extraordinary. She turned to face Sergeant Walsh with parade ground formality. "Engine removed, sir. Ready for inspection." The silence held for 3 more seconds that felt like an eternity. And then a single person began clapping from the upper office window, Colonel Harrison offering slow, deliberate applause that carried the weight of 3 decades of military service and commanded respect. Others joined hesitantly at first, then building into genuine applause. But the male recruits remained frozen, processing what they had witnessed, their worldviews cracking and reforming around this new, impossible reality. Walsh approached the engine and inspected both the component and the procedure Kim had used, his face carefully neutral but his eyes showing something that looked like respect mixed with vindication. "Private Kim, that was unconventional." Kim's response came without hesitation. "Emergency field protocols, sir. Combat zones don't always have working hoists." Walsh asked the question that Kim had been waiting for. "Where did you learn that technique?" "My father. He was a combat engineer. Korea, 1952. Walsh absorbed this information with a long pause, and Kim saw something shift in his expression, some personal connection forming. Exam passed. Highest marks. Sullivan approached with his face unreadable, internal struggle visible in the tension around his eyes and the set of his jaw. And after a long moment of staring, he finally spoke. "That was impossible." Kim met his gaze without flinching. "No, just improbable. There's a difference." Brooks found his voice, ego bruised and defensive. "You've been sandbagging this whole time, hiding what you could do?" Kim's response carried an edge that had been absent in all their previous interactions. "I've been doing exactly what was asked. You assumed limitation." Carter spoke more quietly than the others, genuine curiosity overriding his discomfort. "How much do you actually lift?" Kim's answer was deliberately brief. "Enough." Morrison stepped forward in a public declaration of allegiance, her voice carrying across the watching crowd. "I knew. I saw her training." Sullivan turned to Morrison with confusion and accusation mixing. "And you didn't say anything?" Morrison's response was firm. "Wasn't my story to tell, and you wouldn't have believed me anyway." Colonel Harrison descended from his office, a rare occurrence that made every person in the motor pool snap to attention, as Walsh called them, to formal positions. Harrison moved with the bearing of someone who had commanded troops in actual combat and now commanded an entire base, and he stopped directly in front of Kim. "Private Kim, my office, 0800 tomorrow morning." "Yes, sir." Harrison turned to Walsh without further explanation. "I want her complete file on my desk within the hour." He exited without another word, leaving speculation rippling through the assembled crowd like water disturbed by a stone. The evening cafeteria dinner showed how much had shifted in just a few hours. Seating arrangements that had been rigidly established over 3 weeks, suddenly fluid and uncertain. And Sullivan sat across from Kim, with none of his previous mockery evident in his posture or expression. "I owe you an apology." Kim's response challenged him to think deeper. "You owe yourself a question. Why did you assume what you assumed?" Sullivan had no answer. But Kim could see the challenge landing, forcing him to confront something uncomfortable about himself. Brooks struggled more visibly, his ego bruised and defensive mechanisms activating. "It's not natural. Women aren't supposed to be able to do things like that." Morrison's interruption was sharp and dangerous. "Finish that sentence." "I dare you." But Kim intervened before the confrontation could escalate. "Save it. I'm not here to change minds. I'm here to do the job." That night in her barracks bunk, Kim removed a photograph from her locker that showed her father in his army uniform, young and proud with his whole life ahead of him, and beside it another photo of her father at 60 in his garage teaching teenage Kim to change oil, his hands guiding hers. She whispered to the images with a single tear tracking down her face before she quickly wiped it away. "I did it, Dad. They saw me." Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but tonight she allowed herself this moment of vindication, this feeling of having honored his memory in the way he would have wanted. In his office, Colonel Harrison sat at his desk, reading through Kim's complete personnel file, noting her father's Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals, her own enlistment records showing perfect scores in aptitude tests, and a recommendation letter from a retired Marine Corps general who had served with her father during the Korean War. Harrison's internal monologue acknowledged what his instincts had already told him. The military desperately needed people like this, people who exceeded expectations and challenged assumptions and demonstrated capabilities that opened new possibilities. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago. "Get me the Special Operations Training Coordinator. I have someone you need to meet." At precisely 0800 hours the following morning, Private Kim reported to Colonel Harrison's office with military precision, her uniform crisp and her bearing formal, despite the tension coiling in her chest like a spring wound too tight. The commander's office was a testament to 30 years of service. Walls covered with commendations from Desert Storm and Afghanistan, photographs showing Harrison with various units in combat zones, and Kim felt the weight of military history pressing down as Harrison gestured for her to sit. An unusual informality that immediately signaled this conversation would be different from standard military protocol. "Private Kim, I'm going to be direct. What are your career goals?" The question hung in the air between them, and Kim considered her response carefully before speaking about her desire to honor her father's legacy by excelling in combat engineering and proving that capability mattered more than physical appearance. Harrison nodded slowly and began explaining that the Special Operations Support Division desperately needed combat engineers, elite personnel capable of operating in high-risk scenarios where unconventional warfare support was critical and standard equipment was often unavailable or destroyed. He told her that her demonstrated capability the previous day was exactly what they required. Personnel who could solve problems without relying on machinery, who could think creatively under pressure, who could accomplish what others deemed impossible. This was a transfer opportunity rather than an order, Harrison emphasized. But it would mean leaving Fort Ramirez within 2 weeks for advanced training at Fort Bragg, working with special operations teams in scenarios that would push her capabilities far beyond anything she had encountered in standard training. Kim felt the opportunity pulling at her like gravity, everything she had wanted suddenly within reach, but doubt crept in with the thought that leaving now might appear as though she was being removed to spare the embarrassment of the male recruits she had shown up. "Sir, with respect, it might look like I'm being removed because I embarrassed the male recruits." Harrison's response came with a sharp laugh that seemed to fill the office. "Private, I'm not moving you to protect their feelings. I'm moving you because you're being wasted here." He slid a report across his desk, showing that Special Operations had only 12% female personnel, and the need for qualified women in combat support roles was critical, not for diversity statistics, but because missions required personnel who could operate in environments where women had access that men did not, and because capability should be the only metric that mattered in determining who served where. "You're not a diversity hire. You're an asset." Kim thought of her father's advice, repeated so many times during her childhood that it had become a mantra woven into her decision-making process. Take every opportunity to prove yourself, then take every opportunity to excel. "When do I start, sir?" Harrison's approval was evident in the slight smile that crossed his weathered face. "That's what I wanted to hear. But first, you finish here." When Kim exited the commander's office, she found Sergeant Walsh waiting in the hallway with his arms crossed and an expression that suggested he already knew what had transpired. "He's stealing you, isn't he?" Kim confirmed that she was requesting the transfer, and Walsh stood silent for a long moment before extending his hand in a gesture that carried more weight than words. "Good. Don't waste yourself on idiots who can't see what's in front of them." Then Walsh revealed something he had kept private. That his daughter's name had been Sarah. That she would have been approximately Kim's age now, and his voice carried the weight of old grief when he told Kim to make it count for both of them. Word of the transfer spread through Fort Ramirez with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. And training continued, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted, the male recruits now watching Kim's technique with genuine attention rather than dismissive mockery, actually trying to learn from someone they had spent weeks underestimating. Sullivan approached her with visible discomfort and asked if she could show him her lifting form for future reference. And Kim agreed, but on her terms. Everyone who wanted to learn would meet at 0500 hours with no excuses and no special treatment. The morning training sessions that began the next day became legendary within the motor pool. Kim and Morrison, joined by Sullivan and Carter, that first morning, with Kim teaching proper deadlift form and Olympic lifting basics and the physics of leverage that allowed smaller people to move larger objects through technique rather than raw strength. Sullivan struggled visibly with his ego throughout those sessions, but persisted despite his discomfort. And Brooks appeared on day 3 with grudging respect, replacing his previous hostility, though Mitchell never came because some people remained committed to their assumptions regardless of contradicting evidence. The final week of standard training saw advanced work in engine diagnostics and electrical systems and field repairs. And Kim continued to excel, but now others were keeping pace, competition becoming collegial rather than hostile. And Walsh observed that this was what training should have been from the beginning. Morrison and Kim developed a genuine friendship during late-night conversations in the barracks, and Morrison admitted she had almost washed out of the program from trying too hard to be one of the guys rather than simply being herself. Stop trying to fit their mold. Make them expand theirs. Morrison decided to apply for combat engineer school and asked Kim to write her a recommendation, which Kim agreed to with the understanding that Morrison would have to earn it through her own demonstrated capability. On the last day before Kim's transfer, Walsh announced a surprise evaluation, a team engine extraction under time pressure that would simulate combat conditions, and teams of 3 were assigned randomly, with Kim drawing Sullivan and Brooks in what seemed like either cosmic irony or Walsh's deliberate orchestration. The scenario involved a simulated combat situation where a damaged vehicle needed its engine extracted in 45 minutes without any hoist available, the kind of field problem that required both technical knowledge and physical capability working in perfect coordination. Sullivan looked at Kim with something that might have been respect or might have been desperation. "We're going to need your technique." Kim corrected him immediately. "Our technique. I'll teach, you'll execute together." She coordinated their efforts, coaching Brooks and Sullivan on proper positioning and weight distribution and breathing patterns. And together, they lifted the 850 pounds split between 3 people, completing the extraction in 42 minutes to approving nods from Walsh. After the exam, Sullivan pulled Kim aside for a conversation that clearly cost him considerable effort to initiate. "I was wrong. About everything. And I'm sorry it took embarrassing myself to see it." Kim challenged him to think beyond the apology. "The question is, what you do with that knowledge now." Sullivan promised he would be better and would ensure that the next woman who came through the program would not face the mockery and dismissal that Kim had endured, and Kim held him to that promise with a final instruction to hold himself accountable. The formal goodbye came as a formation ceremony where transfer orders were officially read, and Colonel Harrison presented Kim with a unit commendation for excellence in technical performance and leadership, and Walsh added that the commendation was also for showing them what they had been missing. The applause that followed was genuine this time, free from the skepticism and mockery that had characterized her arrival 8 weeks earlier. Private farewells followed, with Morrison embracing Kim fiercely through tears and declaring that Kim had changed everything at Fort Ramirez. And Carter offered a firm handshake and promises to follow her career, and Brooks managed an awkward but sincere thank you for not giving up on them despite their hostility. Sullivan's goodbye was the longest, revealing that he had requested assignment to combat engineer school because of what Kim had shown him. And Kim corrected him one final time. "Not because of me. Because you finally saw what's possible." Kim loaded her gear into the transport truck at 0600 hours on an autumn morning that seemed identical to her arrival 8 weeks earlier. But everything had fundamentally changed in ways both visible and invisible. She took one last look at the motor pool that had been the site of her vindication, walked to the memorial wall where Walsh's daughter's name was engraved, and touched it briefly with a whispered promise. "I'll carry this forward." The journey to Fort Bragg stretched across changing landscapes, while Kim's internal monologue alternated between nervousness about new challenges and certainty that she was finally moving toward the purpose her father had prepared her for throughout her childhood. Fort Bragg was larger and more intense than Fort Ramirez, the atmosphere crackling with the energy of elite soldiers preparing for real missions rather than training exercises, and Kim met her new commanding officer, Major Reeves, a woman in her 40s who had earned her position through Special Forces service and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Welcome to the real test, Private Kim." 6 months later, Fort Ramirez motor pool had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible during Kim's initial training. 3 more female recruits now in the program, and Morrison serving as assistant instructor under Walsh's mentorship, and Sullivan had completed combat engineer school and returned as an instructor, teaching mixed gender classes, the proper technique for emergency engine extraction, while crediting a soldier who showed us what strength really means. The technique Kim had demonstrated was now officially part of the curriculum, written into training manuals and taught to every new recruit, regardless of gender. At Fort Bragg, Kim found herself in the final evaluation of Special Operations Training, a 72-hour field exercise where her team's vehicle broke down in simulated enemy territory with engine failure and no equipment available for extraction and repair under severe time pressure. Kim coordinated her team of 2 male special ops candidates and 1 female, teaching them her technique and executing the lift together through combined strength and coordinated effort, and the mission succeeded with commendations from evaluators. Kim graduated Special Operations Support training at the top of her class in technical skills and 2nd overall in combined metrics, standing in dress uniform at an awards ceremony where her father's old Marine commander, now a retired general, presented her father's Bronze Star medal to her with the words that he would want her to carry this forward. She stood among elite soldiers with medals on her chest, no longer an exception to be remarked upon, but part of the standard by which others would be measured. 1 year after the original engine lift, Kim returned to Fort Ramirez for a guest lecture on unconventional problem-solving in field engineering, addressing a new recruit class that was 40% female, and she told the story of the engine lift but framed it differently than it had felt at the time. Not as a story about proving herself against mockery, but as a lesson about expanding definitions of what was possible. Strength isn't about size, it's about leverage, technique, determination, and knowing your capabilities. After the lecture, a young female recruit approached Kim with visible nervousness, barely 5 feet tall and perhaps 100 pounds, explaining that she was in motor pool training and the guy said she was too small. Kim smiled with recognition and understanding. "Let me tell you a story about an 850-pound engine." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of chalk, pressing it into the recruit's small hand with the weight of legacy and promise. "You'll need this. Meet me in the gym at 0500 tomorrow." The recruit's face transformed as hope and determination replaced doubt and fear, and Kim saw in that moment the beginning of another transformation that would ripple outward in ways impossible to predict or measure. Kim walked across the base at sunset, passing the memorial wall where Walsh's daughter's name remained engraved, and she touched it again with the familiarity of ritual, while her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Never make yourself small to make others comfortable." She wore her special operations patch on her uniform and carried her toolkit, heading toward the gym where 3 female recruits were waiting for early morning training, and the legacy continued to expand and multiply through each person she taught, and each assumption she challenged, and each impossible thing she proved was merely improbable. It was always about what came after the lift.